In the final year of World War II, the skies above the Pacific were filled with danger. Pilots faced not only the enemy, but the elements: storms, wind, exhaustion, and endless stretches of ocean where a single mistake could mean death. Many of those who vanished were never seen again, swallowed by the sea without a trace. But among those thousands of missions, one story stood out: a flight that should have ended in disaster, but didn't. A story so unbelievable that even seasoned pilots struggled to accept it. The story of the pilot who flew over 600 miles without fuel and somehow made it back alive. It happened in the spring of 1945 as the war in the Pacific reached its brutal climax. The United States had begun its final push toward Japan, with the Battle of Okinawa turning into one of the bloodiest campaigns of the war. The airfields on Okinawa and its surrounding islands were packed with fighters and bombers preparing for constant operations. Among them were squadrons of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, fast, long-range fighters designed for both combat and reconnaissance. One of those pilots was Lieutenant Warren S. Eaton, a 24-year-old from California. Like many others in the Pacific, he was young, confident, and already hardened by months of combat. The P-38 was his element: twin engines, long wings, and a design unlike anything else in the sky. It could fly faster, higher, and farther than most aircraft of its time, but it also demanded precision. One small error, especially over the open Pacific, could be fatal. On April 12, 1945, Eaton was assigned to a routine but risky mission, a long-range patrol south of Okinawa. The objective was to search for enemy naval movement and provide reconnaissance for the fleet. The route stretched hundreds of miles over open water, with no islands or emergency strips in between. It was the kind of mission where fuel calculations had to be exact. Eaton took off alongside his wingman, Lieutenant Robert Keller, under heavy cloud cover. Winds were stronger than predicted, but the mission continued as planned. For the first few hours, everything seemed normal. The two pilots maintained steady formation, checking in over the radio every few minutes. But as they began their return leg, Keller noticed something wrong. His fuel gauges were dropping faster than expected. He radioed Eaton, saying, "Fuel's going quick. Headwinds are stronger than forecast." Eaton checked his own gauges. The readings were worse than he wanted to believe. The wind that had been pushing against them on the way south had eaten into their reserves far more than expected. They were still hundreds of miles from Okinawa, and both men were already dipping into their auxiliary tanks. The situation was getting bad fast. Keller's voice crackled over the radio again, nervous this time. "If this keeps up, I'm not making it back." Eaton stayed calm, telling him to adjust his mixture and maintain altitude. But he knew the truth. Even if they conserved every drop, the math didn't work. They didn't have enough to get home. The hours dragged on. The Pacific below was endless, blue, and silent. Keller's radio went quiet. Eaton glanced around but couldn't see him anymore. At some point during the flight back, his wingman had vanished. Whether Keller had turned off course or gone down, Eaton never found out. He was alone, with his own tanks nearly empty, and nothing but open ocean below. Then it happened. The left engine sputtered. Eaton reached for the fuel selector, switching tanks, trying to squeeze out anything left in the lines. The propeller coughed, spun weakly, then stopped. He feathered it to reduce drag and kept the right engine running. But a few minutes later, that one began to fail too. The gauges read 0. The noise that had filled the cockpit for hours suddenly disappeared. Both engines were dead. Eaton was gliding, completely powerless. At first, panic hit him, the kind that freezes the mind. He was more than 600 miles from safety, over nothing but deep ocean. No engines, no thrust, no hope of rescue. The standard procedure in that situation was to bail out and ditch in the water, but even that was suicide. The current was strong, the sea rough, and rescue planes rarely found anyone in time. But Eaton didn't give up. He pushed down the nose slightly, stabilizing the plane at a glide speed. He knew the P-38's design gave it better aerodynamics than most fighters. Maybe, just maybe, he could ride it as far as it would take him. He trimmed the controls carefully and watched the altimeter drop, calculating every mile in his head. To his surprise, the aircraft wasn't losing altitude as fast as he expected. The strong winds that had doomed his fuel earlier were now pushing him forward. A tailwind this time. He realized he could use it. If he stayed calm and kept his descent shallow, he might cover far more distance than anyone thought possible. Minute by minute, the impossible started to happen. The ocean stretched endlessly below, and the sky around him was silent. Eaton focused on keeping his glide perfectly balanced. Every small twitch of the yoke mattered. If he pulled too high, he'd stall. Too low, and he'd descend too fast. It was a battle of nerves, as much as skill. When Eaton stepped out of the cockpit, his legs could barely hold him. He'd been in the air for more than 7 hours, nearly half of that without a single drop of fuel. The crew on the ground surrounded the plane, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. A silent aircraft rolling down the strip wasn't something anyone had ever witnessed before. Mechanics opened the fuel caps and stared down into the tanks. They were completely bone dry. No residue, no vapor, nothing. At first, the officers on duty assumed the gauges must have failed. But after checking everything, it was clear the impossible had really happened. The P-38 had landed without power after gliding for hundreds of miles, farther than any combat pilot in the Pacific had ever gone without fuel. The base's commanding officer, Major Henry Crawford, immediately ordered a full report. He wanted to know every single detail: the weather conditions, the altitude when the engines died, the wind direction, everything. Eaton, still shaking from exhaustion, sat in a small debriefing tent, describing each step from memory. He told them how both engines failed, how the headwinds that had drained his fuel earlier became the tailwinds that saved him, and how he kept the plane balanced for hours on nothing but lift and airflow. The official record noted the incident as extraordinary flight duration following total power loss. No one could fully explain it, but the most likely reason was the jet stream, a powerful band of air currents that few pilots in 1945 understood. Eaton's aircraft had likely entered one of these strong, upper-level winds after losing power. The stream carried him forward faster than his descent rate could pull him down. In other words, nature had given him a ride home. Still, the flight required incredible control. Even a small overcorrection or misjudged turn could have dropped the plane out of the sky. Eaton's steady hand and calm under pressure were the difference between a miracle and a tragedy. When news of the flight spread through the base, other pilots couldn't believe it. Many came to see the aircraft for themselves. The P-38 still had its propellers feathered, the engines cold, and the logbook showing exactly where the fuel had run out. Eaton's wingman, Robert Keller, was still missing, and no one ever found his aircraft. Some believed he may have run out of fuel earlier and ditched into the sea. Eaton's glide may have begun not long after he lost visual contact with him. For the next few days, officers from other squadrons questioned Eaton repeatedly, not because they doubted him, but because they wanted to understand how he did it. They wanted to know what altitude he maintained, what airspeed he used, and whether any of the emergency checklists had helped. The findings were circulated among pilots across the Pacific as a case study in how to handle total engine failure over water. Even though it was never officially classified as a world record, Eaton's flight was unlike anything else on record at that time. Some of the engineers who reviewed his aircraft later calculated that, based on the weight and design of the P-38, the theoretical maximum glide distance under perfect conditions was roughly 40 miles for every 10,000 feet of altitude. But Eaton's flight had far exceeded that. That meant the weather conditions had to have been extraordinary. The combination of a strong jet stream, low drag, and exceptional flying skill created the perfect scenario. After several more missions, Eaton finished his tour and returned home when the war ended later that year. Like many veterans, he didn't speak much about what he'd been through. To him, it wasn't about heroism, it was about survival. He once told a fellow pilot years later, "I wasn't trying to set a record. I was just trying to see home again." It wasn't until decades later that his story resurfaced in detail. In the 1980s, a group of aviation historians began documenting forgotten stories of the Pacific Air War. Among the files and testimonies they uncovered was the report from Yontan Airfield describing Eaton's miraculous glide. A retired officer who had been stationed there at the time confirmed that the event had been real. He remembered seeing the plane come in without a sound and the shock on everyone's faces when they realized both engines were completely dry. What made the story so compelling wasn't just the flight itself, it was the fact that it happened during one of the most chaotic months of the war. The Battle of Okinawa had turned the skies into a constant storm of anti-aircraft fire and kamikaze attacks. In that chaos, the fact that a powerless fighter managed to glide all the way back to base was almost poetic. A few researchers tried to replicate Eaton's feat using flight simulators and real P-38 performance data. Their results showed that under extremely strong tailwinds, around 100 miles per hour, a P-38 starting from over 20,000 feet could theoretically cover up to 500 miles before running out of altitude. But Eaton's estimated flight distance was even greater. Some theorized he might have caught multiple wind layers, each one carrying him farther. Whatever the exact mechanics were, his landing that day became one of the most astonishing examples of precision and luck in aviation history. Pilots who heard about it later referred to it as the flight home on faith. The investigation into the Mosquito's mysterious flight quickly became one of the most puzzling cases the Royal Air Force had ever encountered. Word spread quietly among pilots and mechanics. A plane had flown across Europe, over enemy lines, and landed back in England, without a drop of fuel. At first, most people didn't believe it. Rumors spread that maybe the crew had been mistaken, or that there was still some fuel hidden in the tanks. But when engineers drained the lines, they found nothing. The Mosquito's engines had been completely dry. Jack Ross was called in for questioning by senior officers. They asked him every possible question. Had he misread the gauges? Had there been fuel remaining in the auxiliary tanks? Had they possibly glided from a higher altitude than recorded? But Jack had logged every detail in his flight notes, as required for reconnaissance missions. Everything matched. The official flight log recorded their last engine shutdown over central Germany at 12:10 p.m. The landing occurred at 3:17 p.m., over 3 hours later. Even at 23,000 feet, a Mosquito could glide for maybe 80 to 100 miles. But Jack and his navigator had covered nearly 600. Mathematically, it was impossible. The Air Ministry ordered a detailed technical inspection. De Havilland sent a team of engineers who spent days taking the aircraft apart. They checked for trapped fuel vapor, compressed gases, and even the possibility that condensation inside the tanks might have created just enough pressure to keep the propellers windmilling. But the results were the same. No fuel, no explanation. Meanwhile, word of the flight leaked beyond the airfield. Some pilots began referring to it as the ghost glide. A few even joked that divine intervention had carried them home. But those who knew Jack Ross knew he wasn't one to exaggerate. A week later, the RAF's Internal Science Division conducted a full reenactment. They loaded another Mosquito with identical weight and altitude conditions, then cut the engines over the same region of Germany using the recorded flight data. That test plane glided for just 94 miles before hitting the ground. No aircraft in service could have done what Jack's Mosquito had. Jack himself was shaken, but not because of fear, because he couldn't explain it. He'd spent his career trusting instruments, aerodynamics, and math. Now, something had happened that broke every rule he knew. After the war ended, He left the RAF and rarely spoke about the flight again. But his navigator, Peter Hughes, kept a diary. In it, he described small, strange moments during that glide, how the sky seemed unnaturally still, how the aircraft never shuddered or lost control, how the controls felt light, almost effortless, as if the Mosquito was being guided. One of his entries read, "We were flying through dead air, yet it felt alive. Every time I thought we'd lose altitude, we stayed level. It was like the plane refused to die." Decades later, when aviation historians revisited the story, some began to speculate about what might have really happened. One theory suggested that the Mosquito had unknowingly entered a rare atmospheric condition called a mountain wave, a natural air current that forms when strong winds flow over mountain ranges. These invisible waves can create powerful updrafts that allow gliders to stay airborne for extraordinary distances. It was possible that Jack's Mosquito had caught one of these air currents over Central Europe, carrying it for hours across the continent. But there was one problem. The flight path showed no major mountains beneath their route. Another theory was more scientific. Some engineers proposed that because the Mosquito's engines had died while still warm, they may have continued rotating from air pressure alone, creating enough suction to draw tiny amounts of residual fuel vapor from the lines, just enough to keep the props slowly spinning. That rotation might have extended the glide, reducing drag and helping them maintain lift. But that explanation still couldn't justify a 600-mile flight. Others suggested that the fuel gauges could have been faulty and that some small reserve of fuel remained in the tanks. Yet, when the plane was inspected, even the carburetors were dry. Whatever happened, it defied every principle of flight. Years later, in 1963, aviation journalist Harold Grant interviewed surviving members of the RAF's 1945 Test Division. One of them, retired engineer Albert Vickers, recalled seeing the Mosquito himself. "We ran every test we could think of," he said. "We drained it, stripped it, even weighed the tanks. There wasn't a drop in it. That plane shouldn't have made it halfway across the channel, let alone all the way from Germany." When asked what he thought had really happened, Vickers paused before answering, "Sometimes, when a man's number isn't up yet, he finds a way home." Jack Ross passed away in 1978, never offering any further explanation. Peter Hughes lived longer, giving one last interview to a local paper in 1991. When asked what he thought about the miracle flight, he said quietly, "Maybe it wasn't the plane that refused to die. Maybe it was us." The Mosquito itself was eventually scrapped, like many wartime aircraft. But fragments of its story survived through records and scattered RAF files. For years, pilots shared the legend among themselves of the Mosquito that crossed Europe without power, carried home by something no one could explain. Some people have compared it to the stories of ghost ships or mysterious survival tales from war, moments when logic seems to disappear, replaced by something deeper, something human. But even with all our modern understanding of aerodynamics, there's still no verified explanation for how that aircraft glided 600 miles with no fuel. It remains one of the strangest aviation incidents ever documented. And whether it was atmospheric luck, mechanical anomaly, or something beyond human understanding, one fact remains. Flight Lieutenant Jack Ross and Peter Hughes flew home through the impossible and lived to tell the tale.